On the morning of the 5th of October 1993, 18 American soldiers were dead in Mogadishu, and the United States military had just suffered its worst single-day loss since Vietnam. 2 Black Hawk helicopters lay wrecked in the Bakara Market district, shot down by rocket-propelled grenades during an extraction operation the night before. The militia of Mohammed Farah Aidid had pinned the rescue force in the surrounding streets for 17 hours, and by dawn, crowds had gathered around the crash sites. Photographs of American bodies being dragged through those streets were already moving toward international news desks before the sun was fully up. The operation had been planned to last 30 minutes. Delta Force and Rangers from Task Force Ranger had gone in by helicopter to grab 2 senior advisors from Aidid's inner circle, a standard high-value target mission of the kind the force had been running for months. The grab worked. The advisors were taken. 2 Black Hawks went down during the extraction, and the ground force that moved in to recover the crews walked into 18 hours of close-range urban combat in one of the most densely armed neighborhoods in the city. 73 Americans were wounded, alongside the 18 who passed away. The Somali toll ran into the hundreds. President Clinton announced within days that all American forces would be out of Somalia by the 31st of March, 1994. Task Force Rangers stood down from all offensive operations immediately. American Army and Marine units across Mogadishu shifted to a defensive posture. The active patrols covering the Bakara district and the contested neighborhoods adjacent to it stopped. American presence in those areas contracted to fixed positions, and the signal from Washington was clear. There would be no further offensive action while the withdrawal played out. A 12-man Australian quick reaction element was already operating in those same streets, and their patrol schedule didn't change. The Australian Special Air Service Regiment had been in Somalia since mid-1993, deployed under the United Nations mission designated UNOSOM II. The Australian contingent had 2 components in country: the 1st Battalion of the Royal Australian Regiment, handling convoy escort, checkpoint operations, and conventional force presence tasks, and the SASR Quick Reaction Element, handling operations that required a different kind of capability. 12 operators, 1 element, working in the same urban environment where the largest coalition partner had just lost 18 men in a single night. The SASR had spent months building their knowledge of Mogadishu. They knew the Bakara district. They knew the militia networks running through it, the movement patterns, the individuals in Aidid's organization who mattered for targeting purposes. That knowledge came from sustained foot patrols through areas where vehicle convoys drew fire, from irregular timing and routing, from close engagement with the population in the districts they were responsible for. American commanders had assessed that approach as unnecessarily risky. Fixed vehicle convoys on established routes with helicopter overwatch was the American operational model. The SASR had a different read on where the actual risk was sitting. By October, the consequences of those 2 different assessments were already visible in the casualty record. The Americans had lost 18 men in a single night in the Bakara district. The SASR had been moving through those same streets for months with 0 casualties. That record hadn't come from luck, and it hadn't come from fighting less. It had come from a deliberate operational framework that removed the conditions the militia needed to set an effective ambush. The framework was still running when Black Hawk Down happened, and it kept running afterward. The reputation the SASR had built with Mogadishu's population before the 3rd of October was specific, and it had a specific phrase attached to it. Somalis in the districts where the Australians worked called them the soldiers whose bullets never miss. That phrase was circulating before Black Hawk Down. After the 3rd, it acquired a different weight because the comparison it sat against had changed. The force that had been fighting in the same streets was gone. The Australians were still walking them. The practical meaning of the American withdrawal for the militia was immediate and tactical. Aidid's fighters could track which streets the American vehicles had stopped appearing on, identify the neighborhoods where checkpoint density had dropped, and map the edges of the new defensive perimeter to work out where freedom of movement had reopened. A city under active armed presence is a city where militia logistics, communications, and movement are constrained at every intersection. A city where a major component of that presence has contracted to static positions has zones where those constraints have simply gone. The SASR kept the Bakara district in the constrained category. The 12 operators continued moving through the areas the Americans had vacated, on foot, on irregular routes, at irregular intervals, through October and into November. The militia presence in those districts encountered Australian patrols operating as if the 3rd of October had changed nothing about the schedule, because for the Australians, it hadn't. The militia's response to that continued presence followed a pattern documented by multiple participants in the events. Somali fighters who'd had encounters with the SASR in the months before Black Hawk Down were consistently making the same decision in October and November. When an Australian patrol appeared, they pulled back. The avoidance was targeted. It had nothing to do with a ceasefire or general war weariness spreading through the militia after the Bakara fighting. Other coalition forces moving through the city were getting tested and engaged. Australian patrols generated withdrawal. The reasoning wasn't hard to work out. AIDED's commanders had been watching the SASR operate since mid-1993. They'd seen the results of engagements or received reports from fighters who'd been on the wrong side of them. The phrase the civilian population was using, the soldiers whose bullets never miss, was reaching the militia's operational planning from a different direction and carrying the same meaning. A direct confrontation with 12 operators in the Bakara district in the weeks after the losses of the 3rd and 4th was a trade with a predictable outcome, and the militia commanders were calculating it the same way each time. The avoidance had a measurable effect on what was happening in the contested districts. The areas the SASR patrolled in October and November saw less active armed confrontation than the areas they weren't covering. Whether that was primarily the deterrent weight of the Australian presence or partly a function of the militia managing its forces after the casualties of the Bakara battle, the record doesn't separate cleanly. Both factors operated in the same period. The streets the Australians walked stayed quieter than the streets where they weren't. The capture program that had been the core of UNOSOM II's offensive strategy was also shut down by the American posture change after Black Hawk Down. Task Force Ranger had been running targeted grab operations against AIDED's network for months. High-value individuals pulled off the street and processed for intelligence. The mission on the 3rd of October had been exactly that type of operation applied to 2 senior advisors. After it went wrong, Task Force Ranger stood down from all offensive action and the capture program with it. No further operations were planned, no further targets were being worked. The SASR continued tracking a warlord-level commander in AIDED's network, a figure who'd been on the Rangers' targeting lists and who the Rangers had tracked without being able to take. In the weeks following Black Hawk Down, the SASR executed the operation, lifted the commander off the street alive, and handed him to UNOSOM II for processing. The operation produced no Australian casualties. That capture became the only warlord-level arrest any Western coalition force achieved across the full duration of UNOSOM II. Every other attempt at that tier had failed, stalled before execution, or been abandoned after the 3rd of October when the Americans stopped running the program. The Australians completed the one operation that closed the list. The wreckage of the 2 Black Hawks in the Bakara district created a separate problem that persisted in the days after the battle. The crash sites needed to be secured and cleared, sensitive equipment, classified materials, anything that couldn't be left for the militia to strip and exploit. The problem was the location. The Bakara district was where the firefight had happened, where the militia had demonstrated its ability to pin a large American force and bring down helicopters, and where American units were now operating under defensive rules that limited their forward movement into contested ground. The SASR established a perimeter around the wreckage and held it through the recovery operation. They worked on foot in the same streets where the Rangers and Delta operators had been fighting 4 nights earlier. The militia presence in the area during that window made the same calculation it was making on the patrol routes. The Australian perimeter stayed intact, the recovery was completed, and the Australians took no casualties getting it done. The sites were cleared, and the sensitive material was out of militia reach before the wreckage could be stripped. For the UNOSOM II command observing the operation, the practical demonstration was this. The most contested district in Mogadishu could still be operated in. The Americans had fought a 17-hour battle in that zone. The Australians did the cleanup and walked out. The contrast in outcomes between the SASR and Task Force Ranger in this period needs to be described accurately because the easy version misrepresents both forces. Task Force Ranger was Delta Force and Rangers, the most capable assault force the United States had available for this type of mission. The operators who fought through the night of the 3rd and 4th performed at an extraordinary level under conditions built to break them. The failure on the 3rd of October wasn't in the men. It was in the operational architecture they were working inside. Fixed insertion patterns and predictable extraction routes had given the militia a template for the battle. The reliance on helicopter support in an environment where the adversary had specifically adapted to target helicopters made that template lethal. The SASR's architecture removed those vulnerabilities. Foot movement on irregular routes meant the militia couldn't position in advance. Changing start points and timing meant the patrol's appearance couldn't be predicted. Close, sustained presence in the population meant the unit was reading the environment constantly rather than imposing a fixed structure on it. The advantage wasn't equipment or individual capability. The SASR had fewer men and fewer assets than Task Force Ranger by a significant margin. The advantage was the framework they were running and the discipline with which they ran it. A force that can't be anticipated can't be set for ambush. The militia had adapted specifically to the patterns Task Force Ranger was running and had gotten effective at exploiting them. The SASR didn't move in ways those adaptations could find. That structural difference produced the difference in what each force encountered when it went into the city. The 1st Battalion of the Royal Australian Regiment had its own role in the Mogadishu deployment that belongs in the record. The battalion wasn't running capture operations or crash site security in contested zones. Those were SASR tasks. The battalion was running the conventional force mission, convoy escort, checkpoint management, presence operations in the areas assigned to the Australian contingent, and the sustained daily interaction with the population that a deployment of that type requires. They executed it professionally and consistently through the same period the SASR was running its operations. The population's assessment of Australian forces in Mogadishu, the phrase about soldiers whose bullets never miss, have been built across both components of the deployment. A community living alongside a foreign military presence doesn't separate special forces from conventional infantry in their day-to-day experience. They observe how soldiers behave at checkpoints, whether the escalation threshold is reliable, whether the force stays where it says it will stay, whether it holds under pressure. The 1st Battalion contributed to the reputation the Australian contingent had built, and that contribution was real and documented. The distinction between the two components only matters when examining the post-Black Hawk period, where the SASR was executing mission types the battalion wasn't tasked with. The battalion continued its work in parallel. The full Australian deployment kept operating across all its components, while the largest coalition partner transitioned from offensive operations to withdrawal management. By November of 1993, the American drawdown was visible across the city. The March deadline was firm, the political decision was made, and the U.S. military in Somalia was managing a wind-down rather than conducting operations. The pressure on UNOSOM II as a functional coalition was building. When the largest contributor has publicly announced its exit date and stopped offensive action, every other troop-contributing nation is watching that signal and making its own calculation about how long to stay and what to keep committing. The political momentum inside the mission had shifted entirely toward the exit. The SASR ran its schedule through November. The patrol rotation through the Bakara district continued on its irregular timing. The militia avoidance of Australian contacts continued on its consistent pattern. The zero casualty record for the element continued without a mark against it. The operational posture that had produced those outcomes, foot movement, unpredictable patterns, capture operations in contested districts, close sustained engagement with the environment, kept running on exactly the logic it had been built on since mid-1993. The 12 operators in Mogadishu were doing the same work they'd been doing when they arrived. The city had changed around them. The American presence had contracted to its compounds. The political frame for the coalition had collapsed. The patrol schedule hadn't moved. The Somalia deployment sat inside a decade of operational experience for the SASR across the 1990s. Cambodia, Rwanda, and Bougainville were drawing on the regiment's capability in the years around the Mogadishu deployment, and East Timor was coming in 1999. The SASR in this period was accumulating experience in environments that weren't conventional military theaters: peacekeeping contexts, humanitarian crises, stability operations in places where the political situation was deteriorating faster than any military mission could stabilize it. Somalia fit that pattern. UNOSOM II had been constructed on the premise that a coalition presence could create conditions for political progress. By late 1993, the premise had been tested hard, and the results weren't producing the expected outcome. 12 operators in a city of 1 million people couldn't change the trajectory of the mission. Their tasking was narrow and specific: capture designated targets, maintain operational presence in assigned areas, complete the mission without casualties. Those were the parameters, and they executed inside them. The warlord-level commander was the only figure at that tier taken by any Western force in the coalition's full run of operations in Somalia. The assigned areas had patrols running through to December. All 12 operators came home. The SASR wasn't going to win Somalia. They were going to complete their mission, and they did. The element left Somalia in December of 1993. The Americans left in March of 1994. The UN mission formally terminated in March of 1995. Mogadishu didn't stabilize. The militia networks that had been operating when the coalition arrived were still operating when it left. Aidid remained in the city until his death in 1996, from wounds sustained in fighting with a rival faction, never having been arrested by any coalition force. The warlord-level commander, the SASR, had taken off the street in October or November of 1993, remained the only figure at his tier the coalition had in custody at the end of the operation. That was the complete return on the capture program UNOSOM II had been running, one figure, pulled by 12 Australians in the weeks after Black Hawk Down, during the period when the Americans who'd been running the same program had stopped running it. The veterans of the deployment have been consistent in how they describe that period. One SASR operator, speaking to the ABC years after the events, put it plainly. They just kept doing their job. The Americans had their crisis, and the Australians had their patrol schedule. A veteran of the 1st Battalion, describing the population's response in the same months, said the Somalis wouldn't even look at the Australians sideways after Black Hawk Down. One description is the internal posture of the unit. The other is the signal the unit was putting into the environment it was working in. Both are accurate accounts of the same situation from different angles. The phrase, "the soldiers whose bullets never miss," stayed in use in the Bakara neighborhoods after both forces had left. It had attached to the Australian contingent before the 3rd of October, and it survived the Black Hawk disaster, the American withdrawal, and the Australian departure in December. It was specific to the Australians, not to coalition forces in general, and it circulated in the districts where the SASR had been running its patrols. The militia commanders who declined to engage Australian patrols in October and November had their own version of that assessment, reaching the same conclusion through operational experience rather than community observation. They'd watched the SASR work since mid-1993, and what they'd seen had produced a consistent tactical decision each time the Australian patrol appeared in the contested district. The civilian phrase and the militia decision were two expressions of the same underlying information. 12 men had spent 6 months in Mogadishu. They'd kept the patrol schedule running through the worst period in the coalition's history in Somalia. They'd taken the one target the capture program had been built to find. They'd secured the sites the Americans were unable to re-enter. And they'd walked out of the country in December in the same strength they'd walked in, all 12 of them, with the record intact and the job done.